there's this very offensively oriented information war that goes on digitally. Everybody's trying to put ideas in other people's heads.
Dude, it's so true. I'm guilty of it.
Yeah, this is you're very offensive in this way.
All right, everybody, what's going on? This is the Other Life Podcast. I am Justin Murphy. This episode is one in a whole series all about Urbit. Urbit is a whole new computing and networking paradigm that many of you know I've become very interested in recent months, really recent years, the past couple of years or so. I think Urbit is just way crazier and way cooler than most people realize. I think a lot of people are sleeping on Urbit and just don't really know about what's going on with it, what it is, and all the cool, badass people building Urbit, building things on Urbit, creating on Urbit. And so now the development of the technology is really picking up and moving faster. I decided that when the Urbit annual conference came to town in Austin this past October, that I would sit down with 10 different people all across the network, people who are building the technology, people who are creating on the network, and people just in this culture that still I think a lot of people don't know much about. So I can honestly say this was one of the most interesting experiences I ever had at any kind of conference, to be perfectly honest. I spoke with CEOs, I spoke with engineers, I spoke with e-girls from weird theory Twitter. Like, I'm not talking about Instagram chicks, I'm talking about like weird theory girls in, the Other Life neck of the woods of the Twitterverse and the blogosphere. I talked with skitsed out writers and post everything podcasters, and very possibly I spoke even with an alien. I'm only half kidding. It was just wild, man. It was really, really wild. A really, really interesting set of characters you're about to meet over the next 10 episodes. And I'm just super pumped to bring this series out into the world. So real quick, before I forget, I do want to let you know, if you're interested in Urbit, it's now easier than ever to get onto the network. So I actually have a bunch of Urbit planets, aka Urbit ships, pretty much computers in the cloud, an individual computer in the cloud that can be yours. It also functions as your identity, and it's what you use to log onto the network and to use Urbit. So if you want to, I'll give you one. I have a bunch, and any listener of the show, I want to get you on Urbit. So you can just go to imperceptible.computer. I made a whole site just for this purpose. And yeah, drop your email and I will get you a planet, aka an Urbit ship. All right. Depending on whether you're listening to this now or 2 years from now, there may or may not be some kind of modest fee associated with it. Right now, I'm just giving them out for free. You don't need to have any coding or programming skills or experience whatsoever. It's very straightforward. I will give you your own planet and you'll be on the network playing around, talking to people in 5 minutes, probably. Okay. That's imperceptible.computer. I will put a link in the show notes, and I will put a link in the show notes to the Dalton Collective. All right. That's all from me. Let me get out of the way and on to the show. All right, Ted, what's going on, man?
A lot's going on.
Yeah.
It's been a pretty eventful few weeks.
Yeah, we're at the end of the conference now. You're my final victim. Mm-hmm. And you were actually on the podcast, 2 or 3 years ago now?
Yeah, I think it was a little over 2 years ago.
Yeah, okay. And that was the first discussion we ever had on my podcast about Urbit. Mm-hmm. And so now here we are, more than 2 years later.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about Urbit? What's in the air for you at the moment with the conference? It was incredibly exciting. We learned about so many interesting things going on in the Urbit ecosystem. Just kind of real quick to kick things off, how are you feeling? What are you seing? What does the Urbit situation look like or feel like to you right now?
I'm feeling great. I mean, I've loved Urbit for many years. I joined Tlon in 2017, a little over 4 years ago. And at the time I was the 6th employee. I mean, there had been some before me, but the team was 6 people. We were in like a little basement in San Francisco. And to the extent anybody cared about us, it was like all negative. And basically nobody did.
Right.
I mean, at least that's how it felt.
Interesting.
And so it really felt at the time like, okay, I'm going to basically just, I could have a nice career, but I'd rather just do this instead. Because I think it's important. But then since then, Urbit has gone from this thing that crashes all the time, and like there are 25 people in the network or whatever. It was a little more, but there were basically like 25 active people. I knew all of them. Now there are, I don't know, many thousands of people on the network. And not only that, but as of recently, like really recently, there are multiple corporations working on Urbit, like working on applications of Urbit, and a lot more sort of cultural interest in it. I mean, that was evident from the conference, right? There were all these people here that were like, they were fashionable, who seemed like kind of plugged into culture more largely.
And who you folks largely don't know in any way, really, right? It's like organic others coming in.
Yeah, it's like, okay, that's cool. Like, good to see these people. And also just, I think the like level of interest from people who own galaxies and they're sort of investors and people who are just interested in like the future of technology and kind of plugged into that world are now, a lot more of them have heard of Urbit, are thinking about Urbit, are starting to understand it more and understand its importance. So it feels fantastic.
Yeah, I bet it does. I mean,
really rewarding.
As someone who's been interested in Urbit for much, less long than you, it feels very different now. It feels like there's a notable, palpable inflection point going on with just around the energy and the interest. And it's really fascinating and really exciting. So yeah, I'm super pumped on this weekend. And you are one of the you're one of the few people really who have kind of all of Urbit in your head. You're a senior engineer at Tlon. You've been working on this stuff for ages, as you said. And so while we have you here, I really want to go deep on some of the technical issues that Urbit faces, especially thinking about all the other engineers out there and developers out there who maybe have certain critiques of Urbit or have certain misconceptions about Urbit. I want to kind of steelman some of the arguments. I think in your case, especially around scaling, because I know that's something that you are focused on.
Yep.
And so I want to talk a little bit about that technically and help people understand the challenges there, but also the solutions that the team sees for Urbit in the near future. But before that, I want to also talk about the relationship between Urbit and blockchains, because I know this is something you've given a lot of thought to. Obviously, blockchains are very hot right now. People are paying a lot of attention to crypto and blockchains. And Urbit has some very interesting commonalities, but also some differences. And I think you'd be an excellent person to talk about this with. So why don't we just start with, what is the relationship between Urbit and blockchains? Is Urbit competing with blockchains? Is Urbit going to be the home of blockchains where blockchains are built on Urbit, or a mix of all of these things? What, at a very high level, do you see as the basic relationship between Urbit and blockchains?
Yeah. So I see Urbit and blockchains as two complementary sides of a crypto world.
Okay.
Sort of whole crypto ecosystem. And so they're very much aligned, but they're opposites in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I was using the term categorical dual earlier, right? So
yes.
Urbit is sort of a categorical dual of a blockchain. I'm like waving my hands here. If you're a mathematician, please don't kill me.
No, that's okay. Let's unpack that. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. So they're very similar in most ways, and then they're opposite in like one really important way.
Well, first of all, what is a category? You were talking before about what that means. And then what is a categorical dual first? Sure. And then we'll unpack how that applies.
Okay. So and it's going to be disappointing because it only applies vaguely, but a category is a mathematical construct where you have objects and morphisms, and objects are just sort of like points, where they're sort of like objects in a set, mm-hmm. And then a morphism is an arrow from one to another. Mm-hmm. So that's a category. Is you have some set of objects and morphisms between them, mm-hmm. And a categorical dual of that category, which is also called the opposite category, is the same thing except all the arrows go the other way.
Right.
So instead of pointing from A to B, you're pointing from B to A.
Okay.
And so it's a useful concept for thinking about, okay, you have sort of two different systems that are similar, but where the relation is inverted.
Right. So structural similarity, mm-hmm. but opposite in terms of the what is connected to what, or what is or in or out of the set.
Yeah.
So just unpack it by going into the details of what you're referring to here. Like, so what are the objects in the blockchain set or category? Yeah. And then what are the objects in the Urbit set or category?
Yeah.
And how do those arrows flip?
Yeah. And so this is why I'm like not sure that it exactly fits, but
no,
basically
it's just a heuristic.
Right. So they're both decentralized networks.
Right.
So blockchain is a decentralized network. You've got a bunch of people running nodes. Right. So you have many thousands of people. A node is just a program that somebody's running, and those nodes are all communicating with each other. Urbit is also a decentralized network, thousands of people running nodes. Mm-hmm. Those nodes are communicating with one another. And the difference is that with a blockchain, everybody's coming to consensus on exactly one piece of data.
Mm-hmm.
And you add new pieces of data to it, right? You have a chain of blocks, so you're adding to the chain. But everybody agrees on exactly what that sequence is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like each new piece of data is sort of this like a priori truth or something that gets added to the world, when it works right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think this is actually a sort of fundamentally new idea that has never existed before. And this is very powerful in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Of course, the immediate thing you can do is prevent double spends of money.
Right.
But just sort of, you can also just sort of build generic self-enforcing games or games with self-enforcing rules. So this is where there are lots of different chains, lots of different contracts. And this is sort of in contrast to games where the rules are enforced by guys with guns, which is the traditional
mm-hmm.
means of enforcing things.
Sure.
So very interesting. Urbit is similar, decentralized network, but the difference is that every Urbit produces its own data and it has complete control over its own data. That data doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the data of some other Urbit. Mm-hmm. And so, a blockchain is public, Urbit is private. So it's like, Urbit is sort of your own personal blockchain, which, it sounds like horrible buzzwords, but there's a funny thing where, mathematically that's true. And also in terms of how it's implemented, it's true. So the Urbit virtual machine is almost exactly the same as a blockchain virtual machine. It works the same way. You do one sequence of events. You write each event to disk, and it's deterministic, so you can replay it and get the same thing.
Right. Okay.
Now, so with blockchains, everybody's doing that same sequence. With Urbit, each person has their own sequence.
Okay, fascinating. So basically, breaking down how the arrows invert.
Yeah.
Urbit is private. Blockchains are public.
Yeah.
With blockchains, you're basically forming a consensus. Whereas in a way with Urbit, it's a system for dissensus in a way.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to put it?
Yep.
Because everyone has private computers. Your Urbit is your private computer, and anything can go on within those computers. Anything can be computed and built or whatever. And really the Urbit network is just allowing for these private machines to interact.
Yeah.
When they want to consent, they can.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it's like an architecture for many, many personal computers to go off in any number of different directions.
That's right.
But to stay in sync when they want to be.
Yeah. And so actually Urbit's networking protocol is typically one-to-one, at least at the moment. I actually have plans for changing that. But the general way it works is, my ship sends a message to your ship sends me an acknowledgement. Each of those is a transaction or an event. In blockchain world, they're called transactions. In Urbit, they're called event. It's the same thing. It's something that either happens atomically or it doesn't. And so basically, in a way, when I send you a message on Urbit and then you acknowledge it, it's like we're forming a little consensus just between the two of us, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can also have a group in Urbit, and then you're basically forming a smaller consensus among that group. Now, that consensus is typically enforced by just having a hub and spoke model, which is basically what in the blockchain world that would be called a proof of authority, where the hub, so like the group host, the host of the chat group or whatever, is sort of maintaining that logical sequence that everyone in the group is agreeing upon. So it's a sort of trivial form of consensus where it's like, well, what did that guy say? We'll go with that guy.
Okay.
And you really don't want this for money. But for chats, it's generally fine.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that with Urbit, it's not just that like there's one chat host, which is a Facebook data center, right? Like anybody can be a chat host. I'm a chat host or a group host for multiple groups. You're a group host, right? It's a multipolar, multi-centric world. And so this is one of the things you can do with Urbit, right? Is like, because there's this sort of flat decentralized fabric that you can build on, you can actually build little sort of somewhat centralized things on top of that. And there are many of them. So it's, but yeah, so there's always this trade-off between, the efficiency of centralization and the fairness of decentralization. And so you kind of have to mix those together differently depending on the application, right? So for money, public blockchain, one state, everybody agrees that like that's your Bitcoin. That's not not somebody else's Bitcoin. It'd be really nice if houses had this, right? So you don't have to pay title insurance.
Right.
Title insurance is a hacky solution to the double spend problem.
Right. Right.
And once you see that, it's like sort of ridiculous.
Totally. Okay. So given this framework, which I think is very interesting and useful, how do you expect the development of Web3 to play out with respect to Urbit? Like what kinds of patterns or equilibria do you expect? Are the dominant blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum just going to be increasingly built around Urbit and on Urbit, where the social layer takes place on Urbit, where people are messaging each other, sending each other money, building DAOs? Is that all going to take place on Urbit, and that's kind of the most interesting dimension? Or is there an even more fundamental level where Urbit is actually competing with blockchains? How do you think that through, or what kinds of frameworks do you have for thinking about that?
Yeah. I use the framework that I was just discussing, actually, where you think about, okay, for each application, what kind of dynamics do you want? And so for anything where you need everyone in the world to agree on a piece of data, use a blockchain. For everything else, use Urbit.
Right.
And so a lot of people tried to use Ethereum for things where you don't actually need everybody to agree.
Right.
And then it turns out that this is extremely expensive because now everybody in the world has to run the same thing, and they have to compete with things that actually need to be public.
Right.
Right. Ethereum transaction fees are just extremely expensive, right? It costs like, $100 to change one field in the database.
Right.
I don't know exactly what it is,
Sure.
but it's very expensive.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that, that's what happens if you try to shoehorn all transactions into one logical computer that's supposed to handle everything in the whole world. Now, there's some things where you want that, but if you don't need it, don't do that.
Right.
And so with Urbit, it's like, there's no central bottleneck, right? If I want to send you a chat message, that shouldn't have to go through this blockchain and wait for everybody else. It's like an automated clearinghouse for the whole world. Right. So basically blockchains have a tendency to get overused a little bit because people aren't building stuff on Urbit yet.
Now, one of the features of blockchains, though, is this idea of single source of truth. You can timestamp things. You have these proofs of record, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very exciting for a lot of purposes. Can Urbit match that? In other words, if I'm doing something in a private group on Urbit, there is a way in which it's being timestamped and it's traceable. But does it have that kind of the same kind of power that it would have if it was on the public blockchain?
No, because basically what you don't have there is the ballast of many thousands of nodes saying,
confirming
yes, this is the truth.
Right.
Now you may have a small set of nodes saying, yes, this is the truth, or you might just have one. And for many cases, that's fine, right? I don't need the whole world to confirm that it was you who sent me a chat message, as long as I can confirm that cryptographically through authentication, right? So as long as when you send me this message, you sign it cryptographically with the key that's from your Urbit. And so then I know it's fine, right? And so there's a sort of many layers of interaction between Urbit and blockchain. So, the ownership ledger and the public key infrastructure for Urbit, that lives on Ethereum, right? So that is a contract on Ethereum called Azimuth.
Right.
And so we lean on Ethereum to solve the double spend problem for Urbit assets.
Yes.
So that's on a blockchain.
Right.
And then on that blockchain, you can put in a networking key, public key, that your Urbit will use. And if you own that asset, you can set the key. And that's basically what it means to own the asset. You can set the networking key that your Urbit will use to communicate with other Urbits.
Right.
And so as a result, you and I can both look at this global, right? So my ship and your ship can both read from this global public data to figure out, yes, I am me or you.
Right.
And now we can communicate securely.
Right.
And then one of the things that we can also do is, have our ships collaborate on a multisig or on a DAO, right? On Ethereum. Right? So that's basically, you have Ethereum underneath, you have Urbit in the middle, you have Bitcoin, Ethereum above. And these things actually they tie into each other very nicely.
Right.
So you have basically, because any interaction with a blockchain you want to do in a sort of private manner, right? It's like, okay, yeah, I have my private key that I use for my account on some chain. You and I have some sort of multi-sig that we want to collaborate on. We want to sign something together, right? So that's fundamentally private. So you want to use your Urbits to coordinate that, to like hold the references to on-chain data, and you want to use your Urbit ship to like send transactions to a blockchain, read off a blockchain, monitor a blockchain. You want to have like a trading bot would be great, right? Think about like what you would need to do to build a trading bot that just like does trades on your behalf based on some triggers, right? Listening to various chains, let's say doing arbitraging between chains or something,
right?
Or you have some program, right? Normally, if you want to do that, it's sort of a non-trivial thing to do, right? Like, because you need a personal server to do it. You have to have some server, some program that's actually, running all the time that you have control over. And Urbit is a personal server, right? And that's something that just doesn't really exist. So it's hard to build these things that individuals can use unless you're already a programmer. But with Urbit, it's a personal server operating system. So you can just install those things as apps.
Okay.
And so you just have to run this one Urbit server, and we make that easy, or try to make it easy.
Yeah.
And then once you have that, it's just as easy as installing an app, and now you have a trading bot.
Okay. Fascinating. So this is really starting to come into focus, I think. So you can imagine all different kinds of apps being pushed to, for instance, the new software distribution system that's now available and now operating, where it's like you maybe plug in your maybe your blockchain identities and your portfolios or whatever, and you set rules like trade when this goes up, trade that or whatever.
Precisely.
And this is the kind of app that Urbit would be perfect for
Yeah.
providing, because it gives you all of the benefits and all of the kind of philosophical attractions of blockchain technology, but doing it off chain, but interacting with the chain.
Yeah.
So the idea of Ethereum as the world's computer is actually pretty stupid, because as you were saying, it's just really not designed for that. Urbit, in a way, is competing with Ethereum to be the global computer. That actually makes sense in a way. Is that okay? Maybe I'm overreaching
to some
there.
extent, because there are things that Ethereum does a lot better. Right. Notably, it solves the double spend problem. And so for anything where you need to solve the double spend problem, where you need global consensus on some piece of data, you need a blockchain.
But for actual computing, like shared computation, Urbit can do that for large numbers of people in a way where you're not paying all these crazy gas fees. You're not congesting this like public network. Right.
Yeah. So you can think of it as having better asymptotics, right? Better, so that, the asymptotic performance, right? If you kind of like look at what does the curve look like of how much load can the system bear as a function, or like, how much performance can the system have? How fast can it go as a function of how much data you're throwing at it? Right. The asymptotics of Urbit are much better than for a blockchain, because for a blockchain, it just kind of caps out where you get like, like Ethereum, I think, is like everybody sharing the same, 1990s cell phone, and everybody's running that. And, Solana is very advanced, and you have like a, 2000 cell phone or something, right? I mean, like it's, but yeah, so the asymptotics are wrong, right? Like it doesn't scale up with how many people, right? So, because everybody's running the same thing. And some things you want everybody to run the same thing, but where you don't need that, it's incredibly costly. So so there's this fundamental thing that blockchains just can't solve, which Urbit solves very naturally. And so, but I do think that they're two sides of the same coin, right? Because they're both decentralized networks, and they're both bearer assets, right? So they both come out of the same sort of impulse, which is that there's just a general kind of feeling that a lot of power structures today are very corrupt. And the best way out of that is to give more power to each individual, more autonomy, more freedom, and more sort of ability to operate autonomously, have small groups that operate autonomously, both in just like social life, monetarily, in terms, when you're sort of thinking about starting a company or anything like that. And so, Satoshi came at this from thinking, okay, how can we have money? How can we have a digital bearer asset? Where it's like, not your keys, not your coins. And with Urbit, it's like, okay, you need a digital bearer asset for your identity and for your social identity and for your computing itself. So all of your accounts, basically, like having actual control over those accounts. So basically it's like, yeah, for money or for some certain kinds of contracts, you need a blockchain. For everything else, use Urbit. And then you can, run both of those you can own both of those through the same hardware wallet.
Right. And they can interact however you want them to in a way. And that will be figured out just by the use case and what makes the most sense. Yeah, it's fascinating. So, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So that's really helpful. You once told me that Urbit is a defensive construct in the information war. Maybe you could unpack that. It's a fascinating statement.
Sure. Yeah. So in my opinion, we live in a state of total information war. And I mean, there's like the meme, like always has been, right? Which I think is basically true. And just in the sense that everybody's trying to influence everyone else. But the intensity of this war has gotten really amped up since the internet, because now I can influence someone across the world instantaneously as an individual. And then organizations can use machine learning, some people's digital footprints, behavioral analysis, and all kinds of other technologies that are relatively sophisticated for predicting behavior, influencing behavior, gathering large-scale data about population dynamics, right? Like how people are thinking about things. And so those are like largely offensive tools in the information war, and everybody uses them, right? Companies use them, governments use them, celebrities use them, individual people use them when they can, right? Like, an advertising platform where I'm going to advertise my site, right? I'm going to like use Google keywords. It's like, okay, they're like giving you like an RPG or something, right? Where like, you're like, okay, I'm going to go put like ideas in these people's heads. I'm going to filter it by demographic, right? Like, and so there's this very offensively oriented information war that goes on digitally. Everybody's trying to put ideas in other people's heads.
Dude, it's so true. I'm guilty of it.
Yeah, this is you're very offensive in this way.
I mean, anyone who's active on the internet with like a real project trying to accomplish something, you're forced into this offensive posture. So what you're saying makes a ton of sense. It's true.
Yeah. And so different periods in history are skewed more towards offense versus defense. Right, like like in 1453, the Turks came in with cannons and blew away the walls of Constantinople, which had stood for a long time, right? Because the landscape of warfare had shifted somewhat from defensive to offensive because of gunpowder, right? But sometimes it shifts back towards defensive, and so Urbit, I think, is primarily defensive.
Interesting.
Things like Twitter, where you can just like globally broadcast your ideas at everybody really easily. Like, okay, that's primarily offensive. But with Urbit, an individual has more control over the incoming information flows, and small groups have more control over the incoming information flows. Now, it's a marginal difference over something like Signal, right, or Telegram, where, okay, if you have end-to-end encrypted chatting and file sharing, then you kind of have a lot of individual sort of defensive control or sort of small group collective information defense. But what you don't have is the ability to coordinate on things like on anything involving programs, right? So with Signal, I can't just like install a trading bot that we all collaborate on within a Signal group.
Right.
We can't manage a multi-sig together. We can't, and it's not extensible, right? We can't just like install new things that we want, build our own software that communicates this way. So this is what Urbit gives you, is that as is any kind of group of people that wants to operate autonomously, you can control which software you're running. You can run that together and nobody can take it away. And so that's something that doesn't exist yet. And it's an important piece of what's coming next, basically.
Dude, it's so fascinating to me that we don't even feel that as a lack in the current internet.
Yeah.
The idea that people should be able to build apps, share them, tinker with them together, and we don't even feel like we're missing something. We've so naturalized the current state of things.
Yeah.
That
learned helplessness.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think you put it very well, and I think it really conveys the magical promise of Urbit. The fact that we can't do that is so weird because it shouldn't be that hard, you know? Okay, fascinating. So a defensive construct in the information war, mostly as a kind of a bulwark against all of this offensive bombardment that the boomer web is constantly throwing at us.
Yeah, exactly.
But now that there are applications that can be shared in the software distribution, it might become more offensive. Is that fair to say? I mean, at a certain point, the groups that are building on Urbit are going to start building operations that start seeping out into the public world, that start, building things that do encroach upon the current status quo order.
Yeah, like you, right? Like you are building your own group on Urbit, and that group will be publishing content.
Right.
And so publishing content, that's offensive information war.
Right. So
to be clear, I don't think this is like morally positive or negative, right? It's just, it can be either.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely fascinating. So that's great. So maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the common objections to Urbit, because like I said, you're one of the few people who have all of the Urbit system in your head. And I think you can deal with these objections at a very sophisticated level. So don't hold back on us. I want you to go, full throttle on the technical details. You don't have
careful what you wish for, but
no, you don't have to dumb it down for us. I mean, it might go over my head, but I want to really address, the engineering crowd. And I have a lot of, engineers in my audience. So because you work on scaling, let's talk about that. A lot of people have the impression about Urbit that it's just too slow, that it's never really going to be able to grow into a truly global platform where you have billions of users sending packets to each other all over the place.
Yeah.
How do you think about that challenge?
Yeah.
And why don't we actually start by trying to steelman that? Like what is the best representation of that critique of Urbit? And then we'll move on to unpacking it. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the best critique is a sort of Jonathan Blow style critique, where he would say, this is a general critique that he applies to a lot of things, and it does apply to Urbit, which is that, so Urbit's machine code, knock, and the interpreter for that machine code does not max out the speed of the CPU, right? If you run knock, that's not as fast as running native machine code. It's not as fast by about a factor of maybe 1,000. So for reference, this is actually not that uncommon. Python, very common language used for server code, runs at maybe 200 times slower, roughly. It's complicated. It's not sort of a flat across the board difference. It really depends on what you're doing. But knock, not the fastest thing in the world. And I think this is the core of any real critique of the scaling capabilities of Urbit. Actually, there's one other one on the network side. But when it comes to just execution speed, it's really, knock just can't crank up your CPU all the way.
Okay.
Or if it does it, it's doing it inefficiently.
Okay.
So for certain kinds of applications, you can't run them in that way. And there's a deeper argument that economically, anything that can't max out the CPU is going to lose to something that can. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people say, okay, well, instead of writing Urbit in knock, you should write it in WebAssembly, WASM, which can go almost at full speed. And it has a lot of the same benefits as knock in terms of safety and sort of universality. And so, I think that's the steelman of the argument.
Okay.
Mostly is just that, it's not going to win because it won't be able to go as fast as something else.
Okay, great. So why are you not convinced by that? Or what do people who say that, what do they fail to see?
I think what they fail to see is that computers are unbelievably mind-bogglingly fast.
Okay. So it doesn't matter if you're not maxing out the CPU?
Yeah. You can go, let's say so it does matter some. Knock as it is, not fast enough. Okay. Probably. No, it's fast enough for what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. It's actually not a problem right now.
Right.
But if you scale it up by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, it starts to become a problem. Okay. So 10 or 100 times more people on the network, more data going through, then it's a problem. It's occasionally a problem right now already.
Okay.
So this is why we're thinking about scaling. We know we need to improve the performance. And again, I'm speaking mostly on the CPU side. There's also a networking component to this, which I can get into if you're interested.
Okay.
But it's basically not a problem or long term, because you can make knock go a lot faster than it does. And it doesn't need to just completely, scream with performance. Most applications that people use do not use native code. They run in JavaScript. JavaScript is also an interpreted language, just like Nock. And when it first came out in the 90s, it was certainly not fast. What happened was there were browser wars. And in those browser wars, companies dumped a lot of money. I don't know exactly how much. I suspect it's in the billions, if not tens of billions of dollars, if you add it up over 30 years. And you get companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, Mozilla, all dumping money into making JavaScript go fast. And guess what? It goes pretty fast now.
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't completely max out the CPU, but it goes fast enough to run Gmail. It goes fast enough to run Facebook. It goes fast enough to run all kinds of things.
Okay.
And so almost all the applications, like most of the time you spend in your computer, you're running JavaScript. So if you took that amount of money that's been dumped into making JavaScript go fast, and instead you dump it into making Nock go fast, Nock will go a lot faster than JavaScript.
Okay, fascinating. So when we imagine a billion users on Urbit using, let's say, the Urbit version of Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Let's say that's in full swing. There's a billion people using it.
Yeah.
At that point, you suspect it's going to go as fast and as smoothly as the current Twitter on the boomer web.
Not exactly a high bar, but in a certain way it is. They actually had to put a lot of resources into it. But yeah.
Right. And that's those speed gains relative to what Urbit currently is when, because when you message, it takes like a fair bit of time and there's a lot of time that it takes. It's not bad at all. It's totally functional, as you say. It's good for what it is. It's fine for what it is right now. But when you have a billion users who expect high speed and this kind of instantaneous reactiveness, those speed gains between now and then are going to be gained by something like the browser wars taking place on Urbit, where resources and developer hours are poured into optimizations on some layer above Nock.
No, actually the layer that runs Nock.
Okay, so maybe unpack that.
But yeah, so Urbit has sort of two general components, or Urbit OS. There's the runtime called Ver, named after Edward de Vere, who might have been Shakespeare. So that's a program written in C that runs on Linux or Mac OS or Windows. And what that does is it runs Nock.
Okay.
So that's what runs your Urbit. It's called a virtual machine. It's a little bit like running Parallels. So if you want to run like Windows on Mac OS,
okay,
right? So you can run like Urbit on Mac OS.
Got it.
So it's a lot like that. And so there's that. That's one component. That's the component that you need to optimize. What that does is it runs the Arvo kernel, like the Arvo operating system. So the Urbit OS. So all the stuff in Nock, right? So the apps and all those things, those are written in Hoon. They compile to Nock. Those are sort of within the Urbit system. And so that's the other component. So those are basically, you write those as primarily as just a specification. It's an executable specification. It's Nock, but like you don't want to be doing optimizations at that layer primarily. You want to be doing optimizations of the Nock runtime in general, so that it can run any program quickly, as opposed to needing to make every program go fast. You always have to do a little bit of optimization, but you should only have to do that with the asymptotics if you're doing it in Nock. And this is in fact what we find in practice. But yeah, so basically you want to concentrate the optimization effort toward the Nock interpreter, which then is the tide that lifts all ships, makes everything go faster.
Okay.
The other thing about scaling though, so if you want to have a billion users, the other thing you need is to be able to disseminate data widely and efficiently. So content distribution is another name for this, right? You might have heard of a CDN, content distribution network. I think that's what this stands for. But generally the idea of like, okay, Kanye puts out a tweet and you want to have millions of people like see the tweet.
Right.
So they have the same piece of data and it just needs to explode across the network.
Right.
So Urbit is not very well suited to this at the moment. But this is what you need. So you need that process to be efficient. You need the marginal cost of sending a piece of data to one more person to be really, really low. So that data can diffuse across the network fully, quickly, and cheaply. This is actually a relatively unrelated problem to making Nock go fast.
Okay, fascinating.
If we do it right. So the other thing about Urbit is like, it's a beautiful architecture. And if you do architecture right, then you can get a lot of performance gains, actually. Right. So one way of making things go fast is just strip out all the crap,
Right.
and just have it not do very much. And one of the cool things about it, when you really read the code and the kernel, after you've really kind of internalized it, you're like, oh, this basically doesn't do anything. Urbit just kind of sits there. Like the kernel does very little. It's almost just a pass through little checks, and that's good. And this is how you know when you've kind of like gotten a component of Urbit right, is when it sort of fades away and doesn't do anything anymore.
So what is the summary of how Urbit will be able to have Kanye's tweets go out to a billion people?
Being able to disseminate the same piece of data to lots of different people is an almost entirely unrelated problem to making not go fast. And the reason is that to handle the first request for this tweet, Kanye's ship only has to run knock once. Maybe that's relatively slow and it takes 10 milliseconds.
Right.
10 milliseconds is slow. And it's really roughly what it would take right now on Urbit. But that's a problem if you have to take 10 milliseconds to serve it to each person.
Right.
Because then it takes millions of seconds or whatever, thousands of seconds to serve it to everybody. But what you actually want is for the runtime, var, to run that knock once and then cache the result. So just hold on to it. And the next time somebody asks, you don't have to run knock at all. You're like, oh, I already know the answer to that question. So you have a bunch of bytes sitting in memory. And when somebody asks you for this request, you're like, okay, here are those bytes. Shove them right out the door. This is something computers can do incredibly quickly. And it means that, a typical computer can have, like hundreds of thousands of open connections if you do it right to other computers. And so, yeah, at least maybe millions. This used to be called the C10K problem. How many connections can you hold open? And then they had to make it to like the C100K and C1M, right? Like, but it's shocking actually, like just how much data one computer can send out. But you just have to not get in its way, right? So, okay, knock is slow. So don't run knock. Run it once, and then the next 10 million times, just take the same bytes and shove them out the door.
Okay, fascinating. I think what you're talking about with the namespace, I think this will be very new to a lot of people. Like I don't think anyone knows that or has ever heard that necessarily. So it's fascinating. And I think people will find that intriguing and compelling. Cool. Anything else on this topic that I'm not asking about, which I should ask about? I asked this question to Philip Monk. He made some references to caching, which I guess you were talking about. That's so you're kind of unpacking something he only talked about briefly, which is great. He also mentioned
other forms of caching too, but
there are other possibilities. He also talked a little bit about federation, but again, that kind of sounds like what you're saying in a way. I don't know if there are there other competitor hypotheses for how scaling takes place, and you're just talking about one, or is this kind of the main one that the team is aligned around?
I think this is the main one, although it's still something we're exploring. So it's possible that if you have me on again in a year or whatever, I'll give you a different answer.
Right.
But this is sort of the main. Yeah, it is the main hypothesis.
Okay. Great. Well, that was very compelling, and I think that made a lot of sense. So let's talk a little bit more about Urbit and blockchains, because I do know there are some interesting projects going on right now. I don't know if they're stealth or secret or whatever. We don't need to go into the details, but I do believe there are projects to build blockchains on Urbit. Can you explain what that means, what that would look like, and why, or what's the reasoning there?
Yeah, so I've heard about this some, and my understanding is basically is somewhat vague, but it's essentially that Urbit is a decentralized network full of nodes, and it provides a lot of really good primitives for building decentralized applications. One of those applications is a blockchain. And so you can build a blockchain on Urbit in various ways. And I think the general idea is that you could get like a little bit of a benefit compared to proof of stake by doing a sort of proof of identity, where because Urbit nodes are scarce, in addition to getting your stake slashed if you do something wrong, you could also get your identity slashed, where basically your node is no longer allowed to participate in the computation. I don't know the details of that really. I don't know how well it would work, but abstractly speaking, I think it makes a lot of sense to me that you might want to run a blockchain on Urbit, or maybe multiple, because you have a nice decentralized network with really good primitives, right? Like natural universal peer-to-peer networking, peer discovery, encrypted communications, authenticated communications, determinism, a nice data model, algebraic data types, pure functional program. I mean, it's like Urbit is nice, right? And so it's nice for a lot of things. One of the things that might be nice for is a blockchain, and maybe you can get some added security from the scarcity of the addresses.
I see. Well, we did talk though before about how Urbit replicates some of the features of blockchain, and we talked about how it sounds like the ideal arrangement would be use Urbit for certain things, use blockchains for others, but they play really nice together. So I'm trying to understand the advantage to building a blockchain on Urbit. It sounds kind of redundant, or I'm just failing to see the reason or the motivation, perhaps.
Well, I think it's basically that so interacting with this blockchain from Urbit. All right, so interacting with the blockchain that people are thinking of building that runs on Urbit, interacting with that from Urbit should be a little bit more natural than interacting with some other chain, although it'll look very similar.
I see.
So basically, we already have applications in Urbit that can interact with the Bitcoin chain, with the Ethereum chain, and there's a fair amount of work that goes into that because there are different data formats, and so you have to translate between them, and there are different sort of networking protocols. So you have to kind of do retries in various ways.
I see.
So that's different security model, et cetera. So you have to have all these sort of translation layers. Whereas if it were in Urbit, then presumably you wouldn't need any of those.
It would all just be built to purpose for Urbit. Urbit native, and it would just make a lot of other things, I guess, more convenient, more efficient,
more seamless.
Okay,
so I think that's the basic idea of why this would be nice.
Right. Okay. So we're just closing up this conversation about Urbit and blockchains.
Yep.
Anthony Arroyo once said to me that in a way, Urbit competes with Ethereum smart contracts. In a way, Urbit is kind of a smart contract platform, which is a very interesting way to put it. Now, does that mean that we can imagine the smart contract logic and what is so appealing about smart contracts is this idea of programming arbitrarily complex kind of if-then actions with moving of assets and data.
Yeah.
Is that something you would expect to see done natively within Urbit just through the shared computing framework where me and a bunch of my friends can kind of program some code that says, if someone delivers X to this group, then they'll get sent X Satoshis.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing you would expect to be built natively within Urbit.
Yeah. Although for most of those things, there's going to be a little bit of an on-chain component.
Okay.
So basically anything where you're actually owning an asset, because you need to solve the double spend problem for that part of it at the very least needs to be on chain.
Okay.
For something else, if you're doing sort of a private group that maybe, so let's take the example of a DAO, right? And let's say a DAO that's running something like a corporation. Do you need every single decision that the company makes to be listed on chain and basically have that ordering and that sequence guaranteed by a chain? No. Not usually. Do you need the ownership to be secure and subject to formal rules? Yes. Right. So which parts of those formal rules need to be on chain and which don't is going to vary a lot. But for sort of informal things where you have some degree of trust, you don't really need the on-chain stuff, and it's going to be a lot cheaper and faster to use Urbit instead.
Right.
No. So it's only a little bit of competition because most things that people are doing with Ethereum, I think they're going to keep doing it with Ethereum. And so Urbit's not going to suck too much business away from it. But there are a lot of just sort of more informal, arrangements that people who are, working with DeFi and working with the sort of new crypto economy want to do, including, management of on-chain assets and contracts. And all of that stuff will happen from Urbit. So it's the other way of thinking about this sort of ecosystem is that you've got public blockchains sort of in the center. And then you have many Urbits around it. And those Urbits are all holding references into this public data. And so you have many private references to public data. This is in fact one of the big problems, in my understanding right now, with trying to use blockchains is that you have to manage your assets somewhere, right? You have to have it in MetaMask or Gnosis Safe or whatever. And, that there isn't sort of like one coherent place where you're storing all of that information. So you're like managing all your accounts, keeping it all secure and not losing it.
Right.
And so Urbit is a really good way to do that because you can link all these different things together. You can build apps that do this sort of if this then that behavior. You can have those sync with other people,
right?
Collaborate with other people. Collaborate on signing, for example, with a multi-sig. And so it can automate and sort of organize a lot of these, like a lot of your interactions with a chain.
Right. I think a lot of people in crypto still don't know that. And I think when like the word gets out about how much you can do on that front, I do think there's going to be a massive sucking sound of crypto people coming into Urbit because of these affordances.
And there already have been some.
Sure.
Because some people, 2 years ago, Sarpin Laplux was telling me this.
Yeah.
And it's sort of become even more true since.
Okay. Fascinating. So maybe we'll just close by talking about next steps for you, next steps for Urbit. I know a lot of people in crypto who are talking about potentially leaving the country, or I know a lot of people who have kind of backup plans, contingency plans, where they would go if, let's say, there was a big, regulatory crackdown on crypto, and you, I believe, are preparing to move to another country. Apparently, I've heard there is a Urbit click in Kiev. Is that correct? That's kind of interesting. So tell us about why are you moving to Kiev, and how did that kind of decision calculus? Is it a kind of geopolitical thing where you're kind of like you want to hedge against the United States, or how do you think about it?
A little bit, but mostly not. Mostly just quality of life.
Okay.
I went to Kiev this summer for a couple of months, met up with a bunch of other Urbit people who were already there. And they're a little bit nomadic, some of them, kind of going to different places when we can. Mm-hmm. And, but mostly Kiev just turns out to be a really nice city. And it feels sort of like it's on the way up. It's kind of like a ambitious, optimistic attitude from what I could tell. I was only there for 2 months so far, but I'm excited. I've been kind of studying Russian for a while, just basically for fun. And so still learning. Russian's an exceedingly difficult language, turns out. But I really enjoyed being there, and it's just good energy. Like, and I would say, especially with the other Urbit people there. And so, I'm going to be moving there, keeping my American citizenship. Yeah. So it's not an irreversible decision. Yeah. But I'm going to go live there for a while and get a 3-year residency. And
oh, nice. Okay. That's fascinating. Yeah. It sounds really cool. I think you're going to have a very fun time.
I think so too.
Yeah. And it's so funny to me that there's a Urbit click there. It's like, I just never would have guessed that.
Well, there are Urbit people all over the world.
Sure.
And Tlon has, I don't know, like a third of its people that it works with are not in America.
Right. Of course.
Not for regulatory reasons. It's just that people get interested in it wherever.
It's just cool that there's becoming a hub that's kind of attracting new people to move there. And it's very cool.
I don't think it's the last one.
Fascinating. Yeah. All right. And what about for Urbit? I'm curious in particular, like what is the next thing you're most excited about? Or maybe specifically with respect to the apps and the software distribution, because this feels incredibly exciting and powerful to me. Do you think there's an app kind of coming up that's going to be like the killer app, or it's going to be like the big flashy thing that's like really impressing outsiders and they're like, oh, I want to get onto Urbit because I want to use that app? What's your sense of like the next important app that gets shipped through this software sharing service?
Yeah. I think it's hard to know, but I can name a few.
Sure.
So, and the way I predict this going is that there'll be sort of like a punctuated equilibrium where there's some growth, maybe some shrinking, whatever, some attrition until, some new app lands or some new functionality lands. And then there'll be a big spike up. And those will happen at some rate. And I don't know exactly which of those spikes are going to be big, but I can name a few of them. So one imminent one is a phone app. You can't get notifications on your phone for Urbit right now. I run Urbit on my phone. Like I have a Urbit client on my phone, but it's just a browser thing. So I can't get notifications. So I'm still in a bunch of groups and Signal and Telegram and whatnot because you need to get notified. So once we have an app for Urbit, like iOS app, Android app, where I can get notifications, a lot of those groups are going to move over. So I think that's a big deal. I think that'll drive adoption quite a bit.
Because then it's basically competing with Signal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's pretty comparable. I think like Telegram is a beautiful user experience. Like, I don't know how they did it, but they knocked it out of the park. So if we can get these sort of asymptotically closer to the Telegram experience, we should do that. But and we can, it's actually fairly close already. But then, okay, so that's one thing. The next is being able to do file sharing. So encrypted file sharing, just, if I want to send you a video or audio file, something like that.
Like a Google Drive on Urbit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But peer-to-peer and encrypted.
Right.
I don't know how much that'll drive adoption, but some probably.
Yeah.
And then the next step is basically content. So, the replacement for Substack, Patreon, Twitch,
right,
these sorts of things. Okay. And some of there are two enabling technologies for this. One is WebRTC, which enables like real-time communication that's negotiated by your Urbits, and then it happens in the browser.
Which is here, right?
Yeah.
It's basically
there. So that landed.
Right.
It's still a little shaky, I think, but it's out there. It's, we're pushing out over-the-air updates to it.
Do you get that through the software?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. And so like a bunch of people have done video calls on Urbit now.
Okay, cool.
Pretty exciting.
I have to find the identifier to import it.
It's Urchat FM.
Okay. And you search for that in the software distribution app? Cool. Okay.
Yeah. And I would ask around to see who's distributing it.
Yeah. Okay.
But then okay, so that's, so WebRTC is one component. And then there are two other components. One is web publishing, so publishing to the Boomer Web.
Right.
And so the fundamental technology for that is there, but there isn't really much like user space facility for that. So there'd be some apps for doing that, I think. That are sort of bridge between like Urbit content and old world.
Right.
And the second one there is payments. So fiat payments, Terrell is working on that. So, 3 guys from Tlon left, formed their own payments company called Terrell.
They were on the podcast.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So that's fiat payments, sort of like Stripe for Urbit. And then also there are people working on a Lightning wallet. And so then so when you combine those two things, right, people can pay for content. They can pay for multimedia content. So then you have podcasting apps, something to replace, Gumroad, Patreon, et cetera.
Right.
And so that's the next big stage. I imagine you're pretty excited for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, I think DeFi stuff. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but once it just sort of becomes more convenient to use Urbit to like collate your various accounts, and so you can actually coordinate to do DeFi stuff through Urbit, I think it'll just be a utility for those people.
Hell yeah, dude. Let's go. It's super exciting, man. This was an awesome podcast. Thanks for giving us your time and
thanks for having me on.
all of your really thoughtful and articulate perspectives on the relationship between Urbit and blockchain and scaling. This was awesome. I think a lot of people are really going to enjoy this. So thanks, Ted. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll put links to things in the show notes, and I'll also throw in your Urbit handle if people want to DM you or whatever.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, dude. That's all.
Yeah, thank you.